History tells us Spain and France fought for power, for land, for glory, but the shadows whisper another story. A story that begins not with kings or generals, but with a hunger as old as the mountains themselves. They whisper that something ancient and unseen fed on their hatred, growing stronger with every clash of steel, every drop of blood spilled upon the soil of Europe. This isn't just a tale of empires, it's a tale of a war cursed before it ever began. The first whispers of the curse were heard in Italy under a blood-red moon. As Spanish and French soldiers met on fields of green, their rivalry was born. But this was more than a contest for territory. In the smoke of battle, soldiers swore they heard voices where none should be. Banners trembled in windless air. An old myth, buried in the forgotten corners of Europe, spoke of a silent entity, an ancient force known as the Watcher of Empires. A being awakened only by the rhythmic drum of war, drawn to the scent of ambition and bloodshed. With the first skirmishes in Italy, its eyes opened. The rivalry between Spain and France was not just a political struggle, it was the first offering. In the 16th century, Spain was an empire on which the sun never set. Its power radiated across the globe, a brilliant, golden light of conquest and faith. From the Americas to the Philippines, its influence was absolute. But from the heart of Europe, another power was rising from the mists. France, resilient and ambitious, began to challenge Spain's dominance. On the maps of kings and popes, it was a struggle for control, but beneath the surface, a darker map was being drawn. The golden light of Spain cast long, twisting shadows. The mist surrounding France seemed to ride with unseen life. On both sides, the omens were clear for those who dared to look. In the grand halls of Madrid, empty thrones echoed with the whispers of future ghosts. In the cartographers' workshops, maps of the empire would crack like old bones. And above the battlefields yet to be fought, ravens circled, waiting for the feast to begin. The stage was set not just for war, but for a ritual of continental scale. The battlefields of the Italian wars became the first great altars for this growing darkness. History remembers them as Spanish victories, the triumph of the formidable tercio formations. But the soldiers who survived told different stories. They spoke of battles fought in unnatural, clinging fog where the enemy was a phantom until the last moment. They remembered the night ignited not just by cannon fire, but by a chilling, spectral glow. Spears would pierce the mist, finding their mark with an eerie certainty. And in the aftermath, as the smoke cleared, ghostly silhouettes of the fallen seemed to rise and fade, their silent screams absorbed by the soil. Every city sacked, every field soaked in blood, was a sacrifice. The narrator of this dark history, the Watcher of Empires, was stirring. Every drop of blood fed the darkness, and the darkness grew hungry for more. The war for Italy was over, but the entity it had awakened now craved a greater conflict. By 1635, the hunger of the unseen world could no longer be contained. The Franco-Spanish War erupted, and Europe descended into a maelstrom of fire and shadow. This was not merely war, it was a continent-wide haunting. Battlefields became landscapes from a nightmare, choked with ash and an uncanny, cold fog that deadened all sound. Soldiers on sentry duty reported hearing screams from empty fields, the chilling cries of men who had fallen centuries before. In abandoned camps, suits of armor were seen to shift and move in the wind as if trying to rise once more. And under the sickly light of a war-torn sky, the shadows of men stretched and writhed, becoming unnaturally long and distorted, dancing to a silent, terrible rhythm. The great battles became epic scenes of horror. At the Siege of Arras, the fields burned with an unnatural intensity, and witnesses claimed the silhouettes of cavalrymen could be seen charging through the very heart of the flames. Untouched and unrelenting, but it was at Rocroi that the darkness truly showed its power. This battle was meant to be the ultimate test of the legendary Spanish tercios, the most feared infantry in Europe. They stood their ground, a forest of pikes and muskets, ready to repel the French assault. But as the battle raged, the sky itself seemed to turn against them. An unnatural darkness fell at midday, and a thick, cold mist rolled in, isolating the Spanish squares. The French forces emerged from this fog like specters, their attack relentless and terrifying. It was more than a defeat, it was a ritual sacrifice. As the final Spanish tercio collapsed, a vast, unseen shadow swept across the battlefield. The whispers that had haunted soldiers for decades intensified into a triumphant chorus. The empire bleeds, the darkness feasts. The age of Spanish military supremacy was over, and the Watcher of Empires had consumed its prize. The night the shadows won had finally come. When the diplomats met to sign the Treaty of the Pyrenees, they believed they were ending a war. They drew new lines on a map, exchanged territories, and sealed the pact with a royal marriage. They saw it as the dawn of a new era, but they were blind to the true victor. In the chamber where the treaty was signed, the shadows of the men twisted on the walls, seeming to celebrate the chaos they had orchestrated. The great map of Europe lying on the table began to smoke at its edges, its borders burning away like ash. Spain's glorious crest, once so bright, dimmed into a faint, dying ember. France's, in contrast, began to glow with a sinister, blood-red light. The peace was not a resolution, it was merely a pause. A pact written not in ink, but in the ashes of millions of lives, a promise of future suffering. The darkness was not defeated, it was merely satisfied, waiting for the next great offering. The final offering came with the War of the Spanish Succession. The death of a king without an heir plunged Europe back into the abyss. This was not a war of two nations, but a colossal, continental battlefield that consumed all. The supernatural dread that had lurked in the shadows now burst forth, painting the world in the colors of apocalypse. Unending storms raged over the land, and burning villages became beacons in an ocean of darkness. Armies marched endlessly through rain and mud, their banners dripping, their faces hollowed by exhaustion and fear. Looking up at the sky, one could see the Watcher of Empires looming over the continent, a vast, dark shape against the clouds. Ghostly armies, echoes of all the wars that had come before, marched in the heavens, their silent procession a terrifying omen. At the war's zenith, a dark sun eclipsed the horizon, casting the world in a twilight from which it seemed it would never recover. The promise of an empire was the prize, but the cost was the soul of a generation. Two great powers fought for a crown, but only the darkness truly won. When the blood finally stopped flowing, a profound silence fell across Europe. The battlefields were quiet, littered with the debris of broken ambition, shattered swords, mud-filled helmets, and forgotten flags rotting under a gray sky. The shadows that had feasted for so long seemed to retreat, pulling back into the forests and mountains, their hunger satisfied for now. The world was changed forever. France, though blooded, rose as the dominant power on the continent. Spain, the once mighty global empire, faded into a long, melancholic twilight, a ghost of its former glory. But the scars of the conflict ran deeper than any political map could show. Empires fall, dynasties crumble, and borders are redrawn. But the echoes of their hatred, the energy they poured into destruction, never truly die. They sleep, waiting. Look closely at the old maps of Europe, the ones drawn in the aftermath of these great wars. See how they are burnt at the edges, cracked and fragile like ancient bone. The world they represent was forged in fire and shadow, and if you listen, in the quietest moments, you can still hear the whispers carried on the wind, a warning to all who would come after. A ghostly hand reaches out, its fingers tracing the fault lines of old hatreds, ready to drag them open once more. When nations fight for power, when ambition turns to rage, the darkness always returns.